Chapter 25, The Church. So, church officials wanted to reestablish Roman Catholicism all over Western Europe and also have it affect the government, and they did this through the use of missionaries. And the church was the center of every village. It was the way they kept town time, and the way that they kept village records from births and deaths and everything like that. And it was just really hard to hard to overstate the importance of the church. In terms of daily life, religious ceremonies were very important. Almost all people went to Mass or worship on Sunday, and the church performed a lot of the record keeping in the society. In terms of political life, the church helped to govern and were big landowners since people sometimes gave their land to the church on their death. The idea being that that would help them through purgatory and to spend less time there to eventually get up to heaven. Now, high officials advised kings and lower ones told the people to obey the nobles and the government. There was two sets of laws. There was canon laws, and those were the laws set up by the church. And then there was regular civil laws, and those were the laws set up by the government. If a person disobeyed canon laws, they could be excommunicated, which means thrown out of the church, and lose their rights to accept things like communion. The Inquisition. Now, this was the tough stuff that they did to try and make sure people stayed in line. Some people tried to get others to believe things that the church did not want them to, and they were called heretics. And the church responded by setting up church court, and they could have trials, and they called this the Inquisition. If a person confessed, they would be punished by whipping and prison. If they did not, sometimes they actually tortured and killed people because they thought it was better to go ahead and do that while they were alive so they could repent and get into heaven later. Now, there were some attempts at reform, but before we get started on that, the church members were supposed to donate about a tenth of their income, 10%, and that made the church leaders very wealthy. And a lot of people argued that this made them less concerned about their faith. And a lot of times the nobles would have their second sons go into the church because this was a way of getting money on some level. If a bishop died, the noble in an area had the right to appoint someone new, and sometimes the appointees paid money and were non-religious friends of the noble. Now, the Monks of Cluny were a very devout group of monks who pushed the idea that the Pope should appoint officials, not the nobles. And Pope Gregory VII, one of the more important popes, he was in power. When he was in power, he was not only a religious official, but he had a lot of land and property. But he changed things around. He banned marriages for bishops and priests and kicked out of office those who had bribed themselves in. And despite the objections from nobles and kings, Pope Gregory claimed that the Pope was above all the kings and should be allowed to choose religious officials. Now, this group of guys, friars, they went around into towns to preach instead of shutting themselves up away from the world like monks did. There were two major orders, Franciscans and Dominicans, and Franciscans supposedly were cheerful and loved nature, and Dominicans studied languages so they could preach to all types of people. Now, in terms of learning, this is one of my favorite cathedrals. This is Lincoln Cathedral, where my dad was born in this town, and you can see it's a very impressive cathedral. But there was more time for school since society was becoming more stable than before, so started having cathedral schools being developed. Cathedrals were the churches run by bishops, and they were set up, these schools that helped educate people about reading and writing so they could serve in the church or become lawyers, doctors, or teachers. Now, this is a picture of the first university, the University of Bologna. And unions were groups of people who joined together in a common cause, and sort of like unions today on some level. That's generally related to business, but back then, unions of teachers believed that teachers should be better educated, so they started universities, which were groups of teachers and students dedicated to learning that were headed by a church official called a chancellor. And these universities became important learning centers, and just about all the early universities were basically started by the church to begin with. This guy, St. Thomas Aquinas, he was very important. He went ahead and he argued in his Summa Theologica that you should be able to reconcile faith and reasoning, and that people should try and figure out their answers. And this was later used by the church in theology. Now, the Crusades, this was not probably a very good time to be around It's a time when the Seljuk Turks, they took over Jerusalem, and it was harder for Christians from the west to visit shrines and churches there. It's not impossible, but it was made a bit harder. And many people and leaders were upset, and this led to the Crusades. Now, a call to war happened when the Turks were threatening to take over the Byzantine Empire, and since the Byzantine Empire was Christian, the Byzantine Empire asked the Pope Urban II for help. The Pope agreed to help, thinking this would reunite Christianity. Ever since in 1054 the split. Now the Pope Urban, he got the leaders of Europe to send troops to conquer the Turks, but Pope Urban said people who went would get land, not owe debts or taxes, and would go to heaven if they died. So it sounds like a good deal all around. Now, while this was all going on, the peasants moved into action before the nobles did. So the lords supported the First Crusade because they thought that they would get land and fame, and the poor thought this was a way of getting out of their miserable lives. Peasants left before the nobles were ready, and they did a lot of horrible things along the way. They massacred innocent Jews, they robbed the countryside on their way to Constantinople, and did a lot of chaos. This was not what the Byzantine Emperor had planned. The Byzantine Empire was upset by this and gave them boats to go to Palestine, where they were basically wiped out by the Turks because they weren't an effective military force, just kind of a marauding band of rioters almost. Now, when the nobles come around, they're actually better prepared, and they're successful, and they took over Jerusalem by defeating the Turks. However, they massacred lots of people and looted the area, and so it was really bad for that. But again, you can see here, the first wave of Crusaders, the peasants, ended up going there, and then the second wave, that they ended up making it all the way over here and successfully take it over. And when they did this, they set up this thing called the Kingdom Beyond the Sea, which was most nobles, they went home, but some stayed in the area. They adopted and started to adopt the ways of the people there. Some had trouble adjusting to the land. Others fought amongst themselves, but they did set up some of these what are called Crusader kingdoms for at least a little while. Now, in terms of Saladin in the Crusade of Kings, he was a Muslim leader of Egypt who took back Jerusalem for the Muslims. His troops were well trained, and they behaved better once they had won than the Europeans had. And after Saladin took over Jerusalem, the church wanted another crusade. This was called the Crusade of Kings. In the Crusade of Kings, 3 kings tried to take back Jerusalem. One died along the way there. The other 2 did not get along very well, so that's not exactly the best system. They were able to take some land, but did not get to Jerusalem. And basically they pulled back, and some of the most important guys were like this guy here, Philip, and then we have Frederick, who died along the way, and then we have obviously Richard the Lionhearted, who we spent a bit of time talking about. And in a lot of ways, this was the loss of ideals over time, because in another crusade, armies decided to go to Palestine by boat with the help of the Venetians. When the Crusaders couldn't pay for what they had agreed upon with the Venetians said, okay, well, you know what? You conquer Constantinople for us, for the Venetians. You sack it and take it over. And this really ticked off the Byzantine Empire. And one of the main reasons why they did this was that Venice and the Byzantines and the people in Constantinople were rivals, and this was a way of getting rid of them on some level. So instead of going to conquer Palestine, the Crusaders looted Constantinople, which was not the plan. This behavior made people less likely to support future crusades. And the horrible one that was called the Children's Crusade, which was led by children. Basically, they all got sold into slavery before they could even go there, because they thought that because the people were bad leaders and the adults were bad, that's the reason why they weren't succeeding. So they pack up kids and they take them along thinking that God will lead them to victory, and instead they basically allow them to die, and then others are sold into slavery. Eventually, the Muslims retook all the territory the Crusaders had taken. But there were some major important effects of the Crusades. One of them was it made the split of Christianity permanent, and it weakened Byzantines further. The kings were able to take more control in their countries, since a lot of the nobles were really fighting. Sometimes the kings were too, but most of the time they weren't. But there was a start of new trade routes and new opportunities for learning started. So some advantages, some not.